Welcome to the MedSpa Success Strategies podcast, where MedSpa and aesthetics practice owners come to discover strategies and tactics that help them better market and manage their practices so they can grow, improve profits, and have more financial freedom. I'm your host, Ricky Shockley from MedSpa Magic Marketing, and today I'm joined by Liam Degnan, the Director of Strategic Initiatives for Compliancy Group, where he helps promote their SaaS platform, The Guard. The Guard is kind of like the idea of having QuickBooks, but for compliance. If you're in a regulated space or you have clients that are in a regulated space, you probably had people question you regarding your security and compliance documentation. Compliancy Group manages that paper trail for you so you can focus on doing your job while still having the documentation you need when necessary. Liam, thank you so much for joining us. We're excited to have you on.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
So today we're talking probably one of the most confusing things business owners and medical practice owners have to deal with in general. Like, I know in the 10 years that we've been in business, it's always kind of a point of confusion. Practice owners, business owners, they don't have a lot of clarity on what they need to be doing to ensure that they're HIPAA compliant. They don't know what aspects of their marketing or their practice management fall under HIPAA. So I guess this podcast being specific to aesthetics-based practices, are med spas, and this will be the shortest episode in history if the answer is no, are med spas subject to HIPAA?
So there's a few different layers to that question that we can kind of unpack here, because the first and primary indicator of, let's say, a med spa's status under HIPAA is, are you billing insurance, right? And that's an important one, because in order for somebody to be considered a covered entity under the HIPAA rules, you have to be processing what's called a covered transaction, which in this case is an insurance claim, right? And so for anybody that is actively billing insurance for the services that they provide, absolutely, without question, even if it's just only one or two lines of their business, super important that they are addressing HIPAA compliance and they have all of these things set up. Now, the second aspect of that is, even if you're not billing insurance, if your intention as a business is to grow and continue scaling, there is eventually a point in which that kind of becomes inevitable, right? As you're adding additional lines of service and adding additional areas of profitability. I say with the practices that I speak to specifically, the way that they often come to us is they're getting to a point where they're trying to scale the business and they're trying to get insurance approvals. And even to get approved by insurance carriers, a lot of times you need to have existing documentation of a HIPAA compliance program. So either if it's happening now, or if you see your business continuing to grow in the future, it's the type of thing it's worth having in place for operational efficiency, for future revenue growth potential, for risk mitigation and prevention of liability issues. I mean, there's a lot of benefits to it, but
are there still liability issues, like potentially, even though they might not be HIPAA related, with not securing patient data? If you're a med spa or a practice that doesn't necessarily fall under HIPAA, there's still potential. I know that might be getting a little outside of your area of expertise, but
yeah, so becoming HIPAA compliant for a practice that is not billing insurance is really more like a risk mitigation type of thing. Because let's say that I'm not billing insurance, but one of my patients sues me and I don't have any documentation of a HIPAA compliance program. It's very difficult for me to support myself in that type of a lawsuit around my existing processes that might having, like, let's say it was having to do with privacy or even treatment related, whatever it was, right? It's a big difference, because one of the things that HIPAA requires, right, is clear policies and training, okay? Let's say that your employee did something that was that eventually led to an issue with a patient. Having a HIPAA compliance program means that you will have very clear documentation showing that that employee was trained, showing that they legally attested to your policies, meaning in the event of that type of a lawsuit, you have clear support that you as the practice owner did what you were supposed to do in establishing these processes, training these people. And if your staff winds up not following those particular procedures, it becomes more of a civil suit then for them as an individual rather than you as a business, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And so you and I've already learned more in our 5-minute conversation than I probably have in years of research, but so one of the things I guess that I'm wondering, we talked about this a little before we jumped on, was if you're a practice that's, say, a dermatologist or a plastic surgeon, where you've got portions of maybe your practice that are obviously falling under HIPAA and portions that aren't, at the end of the day, all of that patient information is funneling into the same database. So does that by nature like extend? So let's say you're a dermatologist and you start doing Botox. Do you now need to make sure that anything you're doing with your Botox patients is HIPAA compliant?
If it's all in the same system, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
So if everything is contained, like you're using one practice management software or you're using the same tools and all of your patient data is kind of intermingled, even if there are lines of your business that are private pay and other lines of your business that are billable through insurance, the entire infrastructure of that still needs to be set up in a way that's HIPAA compliant, because of the potential for there to be PHI or protected health information within those systems. There is a small caveat to that. There's something called a hybrid entity, okay? And in the case of a hybrid entity, that's where like there are true functions of the business that are not in any way HIPAA related. And then there are functions of the business that are. For most med spas, though, it's very difficult to set yourself up to be a hybrid entity, because it means you need to have then completely separate systems for patients that are not billed through insurance and patients that are. So in most cases,
nobody's really doing
winds up needing to become HIPAA compliant, because it's actually more work to then create multiple systems for multiple different things.
Branching off on that, how does that extend to marketing generated leads? So let's say you're a dermatology practice, but you've got a med spa component to your business that's not billed through insurance, and you're running advertising campaigns for Botox. It sounds like as long as that information isn't in your practice management system, then you don't necessarily need to worry about HIPAA for those specific instances. So you're that dermatology practice and you've got a form to generate leads for Botox patients. Would that still fall under HIPAA or not, because they're not technically a patient yet?
It wouldn't necessarily, because they're not patients, right? And it's not considered PHI until they are a patient. The trouble is, if you generate a lead for your practice and that goes into, let's say, your CRM, and you are then providing services to that patient, let's say it's Botox, it's private pay, and then they wind up receiving services down the line that are billable through insurance, and they opt to go that route. All of that data about those patients now is now PHI.
All the way back to the marketing lead.
So all the way back to the marketing lead. Yeah, because now PHI, as far as HIPAA is concerned, once it is associated with a covered transaction, in this case, an insurance claim, any unique identifying information about that person is covered under HIPAA. So like names, date of births, even things like IP addresses, emails, it all is considered PHI now, right? Which is why usually, the best case scenario is you set up those processes in a way that right at the intake, it's encrypted and compliant, because then you don't have to worry about it, right? You're setting it up correctly right off the bat.
Got it. So I guess there's another follow-up question. PHI. What does constitute PHI? Is it when you have a combination of information that allows you to identify an individual? Does that become PHI? If it's just John Smith and it's just a name, is that PHI as well? Is there some combination that all of a sudden makes it qualify as PHI? Or is any component of patient information PHI?
So PHI, there's technically 18 identifiers, right? So even just the name is considered PHI. It's less a matter of like what data is, or how many data points are stacked up, or what the data is associated with, and more a matter of whether or not you are a covered entity and you're, let's say, processing covered transactions, in this case, insurance claims. Because if you are, all of that patient's information is PHI. Doesn't matter what it is, even if it's just a name or just a phone number. We actually have an infographic, Health and Human Services. There's 18 full identifiers, even things like license plate numbers, insurance claim numbers. It all becomes PHI once you have that covered entity status, right? And it's really just a matter of if there's a covered transaction, right? Because if that's there, it's all protected.
Got it. In terms of working with these types of practices, and obviously it's a hard category when we're talking about med spas, because there is that gray area of the practices that are just standalone med spas versus the ones that are dermatologists or plastic surgeons. Do you find that most of them are like doing the proper things they need to be doing for HIPAA compliance? Or is this something that when you talk to people for the first time, they might have been going years without really paying attention to it and realizing that they're putting themselves at risk by not paying attention to it? Like, what do you see, I guess, when you deal with businesses and practices?
Yeah. So it's not just med spas. Frankly, most of the small practice space is not doing a great job with HIPAA compliance. You can just look at some of the government statistics on this, right? But 16 out of 7, so let's say 16 small practices, just in general, get audited for a HIPAA issue. 15 of them fail. This past year in 2022, 65% of all of the HIPAA fines that were levied were to very small practices, like 25 employees or less.
Wow, that was going to be my next question.
Yeah, and what's happening is, number one, when you are a small practice, let's say that, and even if you're a med spa, right? And I'll say, there tends to be this thing that happens where, because you're a small business, there is some difficulty with becoming HIPAA compliant because you're thinking like, oh, I don't have to do all of the same things that a large hospital group does. And that's true to a certain extent, but the regulations all still apply to you, right? So even the terminology for HIPAA is really written in a way that's almost intentionally vague and broad. Because to the government, it's not just a matter of checking things off of a box. It's a matter of implementing this into your business in a way that's specifically effective for you, right? And so small practices tend to have a hard time with that, just in general. And med spas, I would probably say, are kind of in the same boat with the rest of the industry, whether they're billing insurance or not. The industry as a whole among small practices is not doing great right now, as far as HIPAA is concerned.
Yeah, and I think so many people that I've talked to, they kind of have this attitude about it. And I'm a person that's always just worried about worst case scenarios, so I'm extra cautious. But I've just talked to a lot of business owners and practice owners that maybe are the opposite. And they have this attitude of, well, I'm a little practice. They're not going to actually pay attention to what I'm doing, or no one's going to care. But you're saying 65% of all fines last year were issued to practices of 25 people or less, 25 employees or less.
Yeah, it was substantial. And it's not just the government, let's say. It's also the fact that small practices tend to be a more likely target for cyber predators. So I believe across all of the industries, a full third of ransomware attacks are perpetrated against a small to mid-size healthcare entity, right?
And they probably don't have all the security protocols and IT systems in place to...
That's exactly it, right? So especially if you're billing insurance, right? The information that you have about your clientele is extremely valuable, right? Because the level of information that you need to have in order to process those claims is pretty extensive, right? So if I'm a cyber predator, I'm not going to be going after United Healthcare or Chase Bank, right? I'm going to be going after the smaller targets, right? Where it's easier to acquire that data because they might have less security infrastructure, less in the way of compliance. And even a single healthcare record, to kind of put this into perspective, can be sold in the black market for anywhere between 5 and 10 times more than like a debit or credit card number.
Whoa.
Specifically because there's so many applications it could be used for, like identity theft and blackmail and any number of other things, right? So
yeah,
the information is super valuable, and small practices tend to be the easier target than the larger groups. And so the government is picking up on that as well. Yeah.
Are most of the HIPAA violations data breaches? Is it hacking and accessing patient information? Is that what where most of those come from?
Yeah, number one source of breaches right now is hacking, IT, and ransomware related incidents. There's 2 layers to that, though, because in order for you to get hacked, there has to be human error that occurs at somewhere down the line, right? Meaning, I get an email in my inbox, but it's a phishing scam. And it's positioned really well. It looks like it's an email from like some subscription service letting me know that my payment is expiring, and I click on it. That happens all the time, okay? And once you click on that, it's that type of human error that grants somebody access into your systems. So in the case of ransomware, what happens is somebody gets access to your system, they then encrypt the data, and you have to pay a ransom to get that data back. It could be thousands, it could be hundreds of thousands. And even if you pay the ransom, you might not never restore it. I think in like a third of cases, the data doesn't get restored, right? That's why the compliance related issues is so important, because compliance is really about addressing that human error side of things, right? Implementing policies, implementing cybersecurity training, implementing like a code of conduct that everybody is expected to follow. In general, 94% of practices that had a ransomware attack had like antivirus and anti-malware. Only 13% had actually done cybersecurity training, right? So that's like the number one way you can mitigate those types of risks.
Yeah, wow. So when something like that happens, as a data breach, how does it come to the government's attention that there was a HIPAA violation? What does that normally look like? So there's a data breach, they've accessed patient data, and some sort of a ransomware attack. How does that, I guess, come to the attention of the regulators where you get these, the fines that went to 65% of these small practices?
Yeah, so a lot of it, number one, there is a whole rule under HIPAA called breach notification, which has very specific parameters around how practices are expected to report on a breach should it occur. Usually, if you are reporting your breaches, the government's actually pretty lenient, right? You're not expected to be bulletproof. Nobody ever gets fined for having a breach. You get fined because if you have a breach, you might be audited. And if you don't have clear documentation of compliance, that's what leads to a fine, right?
Got it.
It's not the breach itself. Your question around how do they get on the radar? It's actually a lot of times in the event of a ransomware attack, the FBI gets involved, and the FBI will notify HHS and the OCR. Also, just general patient complaints, because if there is a breach, oftentimes the patients will need to be notified of it, and a patient will file a complaint, which then gets them on the radar. There's lots of things that can contribute there.
Got it. Very interesting. So next thing I wanted to talk about was the business associate relationship. So like as a covered entity, I don't think a lot of practice owners realize not only are they responsible for HIPAA, but they're also responsible for ensuring that the people that they're partnering with are HIPAA compliant as well. And that's kind of what led us to finding Compliancy Group and doing everything that we've done in terms of becoming a compliant and following the necessary protocols as a business associate. Can you just talk about that a little bit? Because I don't think a lot of practice owners are super aware of that.
Yeah, sure. There is a HIPAA rule called Omnibus, which was passed in 2013, really only started being enforced in 2018. There was a kind of a lengthy grace period. And the Omnibus rule exclusively deals with how a covered entity interacts with their vendors, right? The Omnibus rule is what first requires, if I'm a healthcare vendor and I have access to PHI, I'm required to be HIPAA compliant. But if I'm a covered entity, there's really two things. I'm required to sign a business associate agreement with any vendor that I'm working with that could have access to my patient's information. That's the first thing. Number two is I'm expected to also do some sort of a due diligence on my vendors to make sure that they're actually safeguarding that information, right? Meaning if you're sharing patient data with somebody, you should make sure that they are actually protecting it, right? So those are kind of the two parameters that were implemented under Omnibus. And it's why, that's why we're even having this conversation, right? So that's why your company, I think, eventually
is that kind of basically
CG.
the idea? It's that anybody that is accessing the same type of information that an employee could access, that it's, since they're not in your office and you don't have control over their compliance directly, that's kind of why the business associate extension is there.
Yeah, because it just sets up the legal precedent that there is a shared responsibility under HIPAA, right? Where I have access to PHI, therefore, as a covered entity, I have to have a HIPAA compliance program. I'm sharing this information with you as my business associate, whether software company, marketing company, IT company, email, whatever it is. I'm sharing that data. Therefore, I'm also sharing my HIPAA responsibilities. And signing the business associate agreement just makes that very clear.
Yeah, so with that said, something else that I've always been a little confused about personally. So you're a practice owner and you're hiring, just in our case, a marketing provider, for example, help you with marketing. Yeah. If your marketing provider doesn't access your practice management system, but they only access the front end leads, are they still a business associate because that data does flow back into your systems eventually, and they need to ensure that it's covered on the front end? Or are they not necessarily required to sign a business associate agreement because they're not accessing the PHI?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different layers to that question. Because the first is going back to what we were saying before. If all that you're doing is generating leads, eventually the goal is that those leads become patients, right? And once they become patients, that's then PHI, right, is the main issue, which is why a lot of those front-end marketing processes, unless you have something set up where like the data gets dumped or is completely transported and removed into a more secure system, even those front-end marketing processes a lot of times need to be set up in a way that's compliant. But then there was another aspect to your question that I was thinking about, and now I've lost my train of thought.
Yeah, so like, I guess thinking of these things, and I don't know if this is incorrect thinking, are they isolated? So like, is the compliance issue that lead form needs to be compliant? And as long as that happens, then you don't really necessarily need a business associates agreement, or do you need a business associates agreement because that person is the one responsible for making sure that front end form is HIPAA compliant?
It purely depends on if your marketing company is actually able to access that data. And this is the case, like, let's say for a lot of web developers, I might not be a marketing company. I might just build websites, right? And I set up your forms in a way that it goes into your system. I never see it. I never have access to any of that information. Therefore, I don't have any direct HIPAA liabilities as a web developer.
But I would say most web developers, even, they probably are just the forms. A lot of them are still like, I'm thinking of WordPress. They're still capturing patient data in the contact form. So by that extension, even the person you're hiring for your website needs to have a business associates agreement, right? Is that
unless they have some sort of a workaround on that, like the form is not stored in WordPress. It goes someplace else. It's more than just new patient acquisitions. A big thing in most marketing companies is that it's also a matter of patient retention, right, and return visits. And so if your marketing company is doing like existing patient campaigns where patients are getting like a message to leave a review of the practice, or patients are getting a text in 6 months to re-up on whatever treatment program that they were participating in, right? All of those proactive existing patient marketing campaigns, all of that's PHI, right? And that's really where particularly a lot of the overlap in the HIPAA conversation comes in.
And that takes me down another path here with the email marketing tools. Like, that's something that we've kind of like gone down the rabbit hole with in terms of, and that's where we just talked a little bit before we jumped on about high level software that we're using now, because from what I understand, it's not necessarily whatever email marketing platform you're using as a practice, they also need to have HIPAA compliance in mind. And a big component of that is not necessarily just the way that information is stored. It's actually their willingness to sign a business associates agreement. Is that right? So like, in theory, like something like a MailChimp or Constant Contact, maybe the way that they store information is pretty secure and everything's fine. But if they won't actually sign a business associates agreement with you, then that's not a HIPAA compliant relationship. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And reason being is because for a covered entity, the business associate agreement is really the only protection that you have, right? So if you're using MailChimp and you don't have a signed business associate agreement, you might feel okay with your processes, right? But if MailChimp ever had a breach, that BAA is the only thing that will protect you, right? It creates kind of like a firewall between you and your vendor so that you are only responsible for what you're responsible for, and the vendor is responsible for their stuff. If you're using a vendor without a BAA, any of their breaches could lead to you being investigated as well, right? As a covered entity. And that's the real danger.
Got it. Have you seen that happen? Have you so going back to like the data breaches? Okay, so that does happen. It's not, so those data breaches, they're not just like the actual data that's stored, on the practice management side or inside the practice on a physical device. It also extends to these third-party providers.
There was a company called FileFax, okay? And forget marketing. This was a fax company, okay? They were found, some of their employees were disposing of records inappropriately. They were just throwing it in the garbage, right? Somebody found all of these paper records in the garbage, reported FileFax. FileFax was fined $100,000, And then the government started looking at all of their clients, and any of the practices that were working with them that did not have a BAA were also fined $31,000, right?
Wow.
So there's a network that takes place there, and 30% of the breaches in the healthcare space are at the fault of a vendor, right? So if you're not checking that and you're not signing those BAAs, you have very little there's very little ability that you will have to actually mitigate your own liability if something like that was ever to happen.
So as a practice owner, it's not only the people you hire to work on stuff for you, whether it's marketing or promotion or anything like that, they probably need a business associates agreement. It's also any of the software solutions you're using, right? So like practice management, email marketing tools, any sort of software, they still need to sign a business associates agreement or provide one.
Yeah, even like even if you're just using like Gmail or Outlook, but you're potentially interacting with patients.
Yeah. And I know Google apps like Gmail, they do the business associate because we have ours, like the certificate. Mm-hmm. Got it.
Yeah, Google will, Microsoft will, but a lot of people don't even think about it, you know, to get that set up.
And the part that makes that compliant, though, is making sure that you get that formal documentation, correct? So you could be using Google Workspaces, for example, and communicating with patients, but if you haven't gone through the step of getting that paperwork from them for HIPAA, then all of a sudden that relationship is not a HIPAA compliant relationship. It's not necessarily the tool itself, it's that business associates agreement that protects you.
Yeah. Yeah, because, you know, to the government, they're not going to be asking you about all of the different security frameworks that Google has. They're going to be asking you if you have a signed business associate agreement with them, right? It's about the paper trail.
Got it.
As far as HIPAA is concerned, more than anything.
So what about text message marketing? That's kind of been a hot topic, and I know it's increasing in prevalence. And I know plenty of practices are doing like text message reminders for appointments. How do the HIPAA regulations apply to text message marketing, to your knowledge?
Yeah, so it's kind of a similar thing, right? Where if you're doing like traditional SMS, it's not very secure, right? So usually the recommendation is to use like a third-party provider or an integration that allows you to process text messages in a secure way. That's usually your best bet, right? So even like we were talking about high level before, the way that they have it set up in the platform with the different plugins, you can set it up where even things like text messages are going out in a way that's compliant. But traditional like iMessage, WhatsApp can't do it under HIPAA. Yeah.
Very interesting. Yeah, I've learned a ton already. This is great. I really appreciate it. And thanks for coming on. I got a few more if you don't mind.
Of course. This is great.
So any examples, like I mentioned, so many people, I think, even hearing these examples, like the fax example that you just gave, they'll still kind of write it off as, well, yeah, it can happen, but it's not likely to happen. Do you have anything to say to those practices? I guess at the end of the day, it's all about managing and mitigating risk.
Yeah, there's a lot of risks out there for a lot of different things, and everybody has kind of a different appetite for risk, right? So some people are truly just not worried about it, and more power to you. That's you, right? I think that the interesting thing for most practices is not only the risks that are involved, right? Because especially now, so 3 years from now, 3 years ago, you never saw small practices really being audited and fined. Now it's like 65% of fines are to small practices. So there's certainly a lot of risk there, but there's also a lot of opportunity, and there's an interesting statistic that practices that are compliant and secure are 15% more profitable on average than ones that are not. And reason being is because operationally, right, having like a compliance program, a risk mitigation strategy, all of these sorts of things, all that it does is it actually just turns you into a really well-run operation, right? Your employees are receiving the same trainings, everybody's reading from the same playbook, it kind of standardizes things. And that's how you build a brand, right? Is by kind of standardizing your patient experience across the board. And to me, that's really the biggest opportunity for most practices in taking things like HIPAA seriously. It's not only will it help you grow from the perspective of limiting your risk, it really puts you in a position where you have actual infrastructure to standardize your operation in a way that improves your ability to scale the business going forward. And for most practices, that's really powerful, because that's what most people struggle with, especially as they grow a business. Is I went from 3 employees to 20. How do I make sure now that all of my patients are receiving the same level of care that I myself would provide, right? And replicating that. And things like clear security protocols, a compliance program, policies, trainings, that's really the only way to do it, right? That's even how Starbucks operates their model, right? Is around a clear policy, training, and making sure it's enforced. So for us, that's what, to me, it's more about the opportunity that's available. That's helpful more than it is just about like being afraid of getting fined. Right?
Yeah, and we've talked to previous guests on this podcast, and like they always talk about how consistency of operations and being able to scale, especially as practices open 2nd and 3rd locations, those processes and procedures are so important, and HIPAA just being another one of those. Real quick, we've talked so much about the online components to this: marketing, websites, third-party software providers. What do you notice in office with medical practices in general? Are there any things that you see practices doing that they think maybe are just run-of-the-mill standard procedures, but are actually HIPAA violations? Is there any sort of signage, anything people need to be doing in their office to ensure compliance?
Yeah, so definitely one thing that a lot of practices got dinged for this past year was not having a public-facing notice of privacy practice. Having a really solid HIPAA-compliant notice of privacy practice on your website, publicly displayed in your practice, it's not only a requirement of HIPAA, but that's another thing that helps you limit liability. If all of that is very clearly displayed, every patient signs it when they come in, stuff like that, okay? But the other thing is actually, there's been several practices that have been fined over the last couple of years, not for traditional breaches and things like that, but actually because of the way that they replied to online reviews.
Interesting.
And so there was a dental practice, I believe it was 2 years ago, that had a negative Yelp review left for them. And they just had like one of their interns basically replying to the Yelp reviews. And the intern replied and then confirmed a bunch of information about the patient in their reply. The patient was already upset, right? Upset enough that they left a 1-star review. The patient then reported them, and it was a $10,000 fine just because of the way that they replied to that Yelp review.
What is it in that reply that would violate HIPAA? Because this goes in, I think, to a little bit more of like one of those weird gray areas for me. So if anything can be a personally identifiable health information, is the act of them leaving a review somehow violating HIPAA? Is there a certain way that you can reply that is compliant and a certain way that you want to avoid?
Yeah. So let's say my name is John Smith and I leave a review, and then the practice replies, and their reply says, "Hi, John. Thank you for coming into the practice today." Both of those things, confirming the person's name, but also mentioning that they came into the practice today, those are 2 things that you want to avoid when replying to online reviews. It's actually best, especially in an online setting, it doesn't matter what your patients say, because that's on them, right? But you will absolutely be held responsible for what you confirm or information that you use in an online platform like Facebook, Yelp, Google. Because if I reply to it, even if it's a negative, right, best thing that you could do is don't use their name. Say, "Thank you so much for the kind feedback," right? And something like that, leave it super neutral. If it's a negative, say something like, "Hello, please call our office so we can discuss this." Don't get into the situation of what happened, and this is the mistake that this practice made, is they explained a bunch of things that occurred and how they tried to address this scenario, and the patient reported them because it was private information.
Yeah, so I guess especially avoid like referencing the procedure or service they had. Like,
oh yeah, especially in a med spa environment. Yeah, depending on the procedures and the things that are happening there, dermatology, whatever it is. That's a bad idea. You're best to leave it super neutral in any type of an online context. Every practice, even if, because this is another liability issue, you should have a social media policy, right? That your employees are signing before they start working for you, because that'll help you avoid those types of scenarios.
Good to know. So there's obviously a lot here. I think a lot of practice owners are going to watch this and probably realize they have some work to do. So thinking of those next steps, you're a practice owner, you're watching the end of this episode. What should they be doing? Like, where do they go? I know it can be super overwhelming because it was for us, even as a marketing provider, to like really dig into this and take this seriously and take our responsibility seriously. As a practice owner, where do they go next? Like, what is the next step to making sure they're dotting all their I's and crossing all their T's here?
Yeah, so like the question of where to begin is always kind of the hardest because it's a big beast to tackle. The thing that I always recommend, and this is really the most foundational HIPAA requirement that there is the expectation that you're doing an annual HIPAA risk analysis, is what they call it. And that's it's a required annual assessment that you need to do. So it's like a self-audit where you go through the regulation, make sure you have all the right policies in place, check your IT precautions, your physical site. And by going through that assessment process, it kind of gives you the insight that you need to then know, all right, what are my issues? What needs to be addressed so that you could start on it? And there's tons of resources available for that. Like even a service like ours is really designed to help practices automate that process. So you can happily reach out to us, right? But
yeah, we use Compliancy Group for all watching, and like I honestly would be at a loss. Like you could give me those audits all day, you could give me all the paperwork, and if I'm just there without my hand being held, I'm not going to even know where to start. Like I've gone back and forth when we do our annual review and audit. Like I always have a bunch of questions because I'm unsure about what the language means. I'm unsure about our system and process and if we're doing things correctly and what is right and wrong. So like, I definitely would vouch for just hiring an outside consultant, because my opinion is like, you're really not going to be able to do this successfully on your own because you don't have the knowledge, experience, or expertise to do so. I don't know if you feel that way, if you have people that handle it themselves and can kind of figure it out, but I almost feel like that's a real long shot.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the main reason we exist, right?
Yeah.
We want to, because especially within a small practice, it's rare to have somebody that has like actual compliance or HIPAA expertise. And so being able to have like a software that you could use to automate a lot of those processes, have the help of a rep on our end to walk them through everything, keeps it simple. Yeah, so that's kind of that's our whole model.
So for those wanting to reach out to Compliancy Group, just going to the website, the best bet for them?
Yeah, you can go to compliancygroup.com. You can also, they could feel free to email me. My email is literally just liam@compliancygroup.com. So
okay, awesome. We'll put that in the show notes here too on all the platforms.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Liam. I appreciate it so much. I learned a ton today. I know that everybody watching definitely did. So we appreciate having you on.
Hey, fantastic, Ricky. This is great.
Great rest of the week. Yeah, thank you. Thanks everyone for tuning in. This podcast is a production of Med Spa Magic Marketing. If your med spa or aesthetic practice is in need of digital marketing services, help with advertising on Facebook, Instagram, Google, lead generation, and booking more appointments, please visit medspamagicmarketing.com.